Imagine, just for a moment, that the soft hum around you disappears, that the familiar glow of modern light is replaced by the dim, trembling warmth of a gas lamp, and that the walls protecting you from the night become thin bricks fighting to keep out a world made of cold and drifting snow. Because tonight, as you drift slowly towards sleep, we are stepping back into New York City in the early spring of 1888, on the eve of a storm so immense that people would still whisper about it decades later. A storm that buried streets, silenced trains, froze rivers, and turned one of the loudest cities on earth into a silent maze of white, where survival depended on tiny choices made the night before. So before we open the door to that past, before we feel the sting of that forgotten wind, take a breath, settle into your blankets, and only if you genuinely enjoy these slow journeys through history, tap like or subscribe, as a quiet gesture that says you want to hear the rest of the story. And if you wish, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there, because there is something comforting in knowing that while we revisit a frozen March night long gone, people all over the world are drifting to sleep under different skies. Now close your eyes, or simply let them soften, and imagine that it is not your city beyond the window tonight, but New York in the 19th century, when church steeples pierced the skyline instead of steel towers, when the air smelled of horse leather, coal smoke and salt from the harbour, and when weather forecasts were no more than guesses scribbled in newspapers by men staring at crude barometers and half-trusted telegrams. It is March 1888, and although no one knows it yet, although people hurry through the streets thinking only of supper and warmth and tomorrow's errands, the decisions they make this evening, whether to buy extra coal, whether to visit a friend across town, whether to take the last ferry, will determine who faces the coming days in relative comfort, and who becomes lost in the white silence of a storm that cares nothing for preparation or luck. If you step into that city with me, the first thing you notice is an uneasiness in the air, not the sharp warning of a true winter storm, but a heavy dampness that feels indecisive, as if the atmosphere itself cannot decide whether it belongs to winter or early spring. The cobblestones glisten from an earlier drizzle, carriage wheels splash through shallow puddles, and people wrap their coats a little tighter without understanding why, sensing simply that something is shifting overhead. The sky has become a low, stubborn blanket of pale grey, not dramatic enough to alarm anyone, yet thick enough that no stars show through. And every now and then you can see faint seams, long ribbons of clouds sliding past one another in different directions, two separate weather systems meeting, twisting, negotiating. Though in 1888, no one in the city has the tools to read such signs properly, and no one knows that those clouds hide the beginning of a catastrophic union. Down by the waterfront, the river moves sluggishly between patches of thin ice, and sailors unloading cargo keep glancing at the horizon where a white haze is forming, the kind that old seamen distrust even when they can't yet explain why. One man wipes his brow with a wool glove and mutters something about sea smoke, an omen understood only by those who have crossed enough winters to recognize danger in its earliest, quietest form. The ferries, still running steadily, are crowded with commuters who clutch their coats and lean away from the spray, unaware that many of them will not see the river again for days. The decks echo with hurried footsteps, the clink of metal rails, and the faint whistle of a wind beginning to sharpen as if drawing its first breath before speaking. In the neighborhoods away from the docks, the gas lamps are lit one by one, each sending out a trembling circle of golden light, and children watch from windows as the lamplighter moves down the street, tapping each lamp awake with a long iron pole. It is an ordinary ritual, comforting and familiar, and no one imagines that within 24 hours those same lamps will be buried under walls of wind-driven snow. Inside narrow brownstones and small brick homes, families gather around stoves, warming their hands, finishing the day's chores, and the sound of the elevated train rattles faintly in the distance. In the crowded tenements of the Lower East Side, dozens of families share the same thin walls, the same stairwell heavy with coal dust, the same fragile warmth bought with careful handfuls of precious fuel. Somewhere, a mother scolds her child for letting warmth escape through an open door, never guessing that the cold she fights tonight is only a shadow of what is coming, and that by tomorrow every crack in every window will feel like a threat. High above the city, in a telegraph office humming with coded clicks, a young operator frowns at a burst of odd static flickering through the line. He shakes it off, blames it on distant ice, and keeps working, unaware that those small crackles are the first quiet warnings the storm is whispering through the wires. And when the first snow begins to fall, soft, hesitant, melting upon touch, people glance upward, smile or shrug, and carry on with their evening, thinking only of wet boots or slippery streets, not of collapsed trains, frozen river crossings, and houses sealed shut under drifts taller than men. The snow that begins as a harmless decoration, a light dusting that settles on hat brims and melts along warm door frames, slowly thickens as the night deepens, turning from a gentle inconvenience into a quiet curtain that softens the edges of buildings and blurs the outlines of street signs. And though people still walk with confidence, still hum tunes under their breath and call out greetings to neighbours, there is an unmistakable change in the rhythm of the city, a subtle slowing as if New York itself senses something approaching that human intuition has not yet caught up to. A policeman making his rounds along Broadway pulls his cape tighter around his shoulders, stamping his boots against the cold, and while he does not feel fear, he feels a strange alertness, a faint prickle at the back of the neck that old patrolmen know to trust, even when they have no words for it. He glances at the sky, mutters odd weather tonight, and carries on, unaware that soon his entire beat will be swallowed in a white, roaring void. In a boarding house on 23rd Street, the stove glows with a tired orange light. Men sit with their boots propped near the fire, and someone jokes about a bit of March mischief. Certain the snow will pass by morning, laughter drifts easily in the warm room, mingling with the faint hiss of steam pipes and the tapping of sleet against the window, and no one notices that the flakes are no longer melting when they touch the glass. They cling, they pile, they persist. Farther downtown, a newspaper vendor, too poor to close early, calls out the last editions of the evening paper, his breath hanging pale in the air. He does not know that by tomorrow morning he will be stranded in a drift taller than himself, rescued only by a passing policeman whose face he will never see again beneath the frost-covered scarf. And high above them all the storm's two great bodies, one cold and fierce from the north, one warm and wet from the south, collide invisibly somewhere above the Atlantic coastline, winding themselves around each other like titans wrestling in slow motion, creating a spiral of power that no instrument of 1888 is advanced enough to measure or predict. The pressure drops faster than it ever has in recorded New York history, and every telegraph wire strung across the region vibrates with static like the plucked strings of an unseen instrument. If you step back into the streets with me for a moment, you notice that the sound of the city is changing. Carriages still pass, but their wheels drag through thicker snow, leaving ruts that fill in behind them almost instantly, and the familiar clop of horses' hooves becomes muffled, as though wrapped in wool, the air swallowing each impact before it can echo. Inside small apartments, coal fires crackle and hiss, and families tuck children beneath heavy wool blankets, trusting in ordinary routines, unaware that by morning the firewood they think will last 3 days will barely last 3 hours in the deadly cold that is descending upon them. In tenement rooms where insulation is little more than thin wood and layers of old newspaper, mothers press rags into window cracks and wish for more than they have. Somewhere around midnight, a telegraph operator in a small office along the East River taps desperately at his machine, trying to send one last weather warning before the lines ice over. His fingers numb, he leans forward, ear pressed to the receiver, but all he hears is static, a low crackling that rises and falls like a distant voice trying to speak through the storm, and then, suddenly, nothing. In the wealthy neighborhoods of the Upper East Side, families are already asleep in feather beds, warm under heavy comforters, believing their thick walls and well-stocked pantries will protect them from whatever the night brings. unaware that within hours the wind will slam against their shutters hard enough to splinter the wood, and that snow will climb their rooftops like a living thing, determined to swallow every ledge and eave. By 2 a.m., the city begins to lose its shape. The lamps still burn, but their halos shrink as the snow thickens, turning each pool of light into a small golden island in a sea of white. People walking home lean forward, shoulders hunched, eyes narrowed against the swirling flakes that sting like tiny needles as the temperature plunges far faster than anyone expects for early spring. A young boy delivering newspapers, too poor to stop his route early, trudges through rising drifts, humming to keep his spirits up, unaware that historians will later estimate hundreds across the northeast will not survive this night, and that he could so easily be one of them if not for his stubborn determination and the lucky shelter he will stumble into just before dawn. Somewhere in the city, a journalist writing by lamplight pauses, sensing a strange stillness in the air. He takes out his diary and notes, a peculiar hush before the snow's advance, as if the sky were catching its breath, unaware that this line will one day be one of the few surviving first-hand records from the storm's first hours. And you, in this story, standing on the stoop of your small New York home, watch the flakes swirl in rising spirals around the lamplight, and when you lift your hand to brush the snow from your coat collar, the cold bites deeper than it should, sharper, fiercer, hinting that this is not the playful snow of early spring. This is something else, something with weight, something with intention. When you finally step inside, closing the door against the wind, the city's heartbeat seems to fade behind you. The streets grow muffled, the usual hum of traffic, and voices dimming beneath the thickening blanket of white, and for the first time you feel a small, inexplicable pull of unease, as though the storm is no longer outside, but pressing gently against the walls, testing them, whispering through every crack and seam. Snow in March should feel like an inconvenience, but this feels like a warning. And by morning it will no longer be a warning. It will be a siege. When morning finally arrives, it does not feel like morning at all, because the usual signs of dawn, the soft brightening of the sky, the distant echo of carriage wheels, the murmuring voices of early workers, are gone, swallowed by a strange dimness that makes you wonder for a moment if you have woken in the middle of the night instead of the beginning of a new day. The air inside your room feels heavy and unmoving, cold enough that your breath rises in slow curls of white. You sit up slowly, rubbing your hands together for warmth, and when you reach for the curtain, your fingers hesitate, sensing that something on the other side is not quite right. And when you finally pull the fabric aside, your body stiffens with disbelief, because there is no sky, no street, no distant building, only a solid wall of swirling, blinding snow pressed directly against the window pane, so close that it feels as if the storm is staring back at you. You touch the glass, and the cold leaps into your skin instantly, numbing your fingertips, frost spiders out beneath your touch like delicate white branches, and beyond the frozen patterns the world shifts in vague, trembling shapes. Something moving, something collapsing, something roaring, but everything is swallowed almost immediately by the thick white veil that has replaced the city you knew just hours ago. When you open your door, an icy gust punches into your chest and snow spills inside in a sudden rush, piling instantly around your boots. The drift outside is already up to your waist, and the wind tears at your coat with the force of something alive, making it almost impossible to breathe, so you shove the door closed again and lean your weight against it, heart pounding, realizing with a heavy swallow that leaving the house is not just difficult, it is impossible. Historians would later argue whether the storm reached hurricane-force gusts inside Manhattan, but to you in this moment such debates feel meaningless, because the house trembles around you like a living thing under pressure. The windows rattle in their frames, the chimney moans in long, hollow notes, and the wind outside sounds less like air and more like a great furious animal clawing at every wall it can reach. Your small coal fire wheezes in the draft, struggling to stay alive, and when you crouch to feed it more fuel, the sparks leap upward with a frantic urgency, as if the flame itself fears being extinguished. The kettle on the stove rattles faintly, trembling from the cold seeping in through invisible cracks around the window frame, and your room feels smaller, tighter, as though the snow outside is pressing its weight against every brick. Somewhere in the distance a bell clangs, perhaps a ferry horn, perhaps a church tower, but the sound is warped, stretched, almost spectral, as if it is echoing through snow instead of air. The city's familiar noises have been distorted into strange, distant ghosts of themselves. You move to the back window hoping for a clearer view, but the world there is just as lost, a white blur that seems to move in slow, swirling currents. The air outside looks thick enough to touch, like milk being poured endlessly through invisible fingers, and every few seconds you hear sharp cracking sounds. Telegraph poles snapping under the weight of ice, wires breaking, rooftops shifting dangerously under feet of snow. In the crowded tenements downtown, families have already realized the severity of the situation. Mothers gather children close to tiny stoves, burning anything that will catch, broken furniture, wooden crates, even pieces of old floorboard, as the air fills with the sour smell of boiling potatoes and damp wool, while children cough behind scarves tied over their faces to warm the air before they breathe it in. Out on the avenues, those who attempted to travel early are already stranded. Horses, panicked by the wind and blinded by the snow, bolt aimlessly before vanishing into white nothingness, and later newspapers will describe bodies found standing upright, frozen mid-step, as if time itself paused between one breath and the next. The city's elevated trains, once symbols of modern progress, have ground to a halt. The tracks buckle and freeze, engines stall, and passengers huddle in dark, motionless carriages, their breaths fogging the icy windows as they wait for help that will not arrive until long after the storm has passed. Somewhere along the East River, a ferry is trapped in the channel, pinned by rising ice, its passengers pressed together for warmth, listening to the river groan beneath the hull, as if the water itself is turning to stone. They will not be rescued for many hours, and some will not survive that wait. You return to your own cold room, haunted by a strange guilt, the guilt of having shelter however fragile, while so many others face the storm in open streets, on stalled trains, in frozen boats. You think of the milkman who still tried to make his rounds before dawn, the policeman who warned you shyly the night before, the child newspaper seller trudging through darkness and snow, and you wonder who among them is still alive. When a dull, heavy thud shakes the house, you startle, imagining a collapsing roof nearby or a chimney giving way under the weight of ice. The storm outside screams again, louder, angrier, and you realize with a slow, sinking certainty that this is no longer a snowfall. This is a siege without mercy, and survival will require patience, warmth, and a kind of stubbornness you are not yet sure you possess. And as you sit by the fading fire, listening to the storm claw at every corner of your home, the world outside has already begun to vanish, not just beneath snow but beneath silence. You wake again after drifting into a shallow, uneasy sleep, and for a moment you cannot tell what time it is because the room is still dark, darker than any morning has a right to be, and when you reach for the window once more, frost crackles beneath your fingertips, like thin glass splintering in slow motion, reminding you that the storm's grip has only tightened while you rested. The fire has died completely, leaving the air inside your home colder than the hallway of a tomb. Your breath rises in trembling clouds, the air so crisp that every inhale burns like winter smoke, and you pull your coat tighter around your body, suddenly aware of how vulnerable the walls around you truly are. Not stone fortifications, but thin layers of brick and plaster, fighting a battle against a storm that fills the entire horizon. When you try the front door again, it refuses to move, held shut by the enormous weight of the drift outside. You push once, twice, then lean your whole body into it, but the snow does not budge, as if the world has sealed you inside for your own protection, or perhaps as a quiet warning that venturing out now would mean stepping into a white oblivion, where even sound cannot find you. Historians would later write that thousands of New Yorkers awoke this very morning to find themselves prisoners in their own homes, their doors opening into walls of snow, their windows dark with ice, their chimneys clogged and useless beneath heavy drifts, and standing here, shivering in the dim light of a dying room. You understand exactly what that must have felt like. Not panic, not yet, but a deep, still disbelief, like the city itself has paused its breathing. A faint scratching sound draws your attention. At first you think it might be an animal, but then you recognize the rhythmic scrape of a neighbor trying desperately to clear his roof vent, perhaps standing in his attic with a shovel, breaking through ice in the hope of keeping a few thin breaths of heat alive. The sound is muffled, swallowed by the storm, but it is enough to remind you that other people are still out there, each one fighting the same invisible enemy. You kneel beside the stove and coax the fire back to life with the last few usable pieces of coal, watching the flame catch reluctantly, its small glow turning the shadows into soft, trembling shapes. The warmth that slowly fills the room is subtle, hardly enough to chase away the cold, but it feels like a tiny victory against a force determined to silence the entire city. Boiling snow for water becomes your next task, the kettle trembling on the stove as the flame licks at its frozen metal. The water tastes faintly metallic like old coins or iron railings, but it warms your hands as you hold the cup, moving your fingers around it in slow circles and letting the steam brush gently against your face like a fragile reminder that you are still alive. Outside, the storm's voice has changed again, no longer the furious roar of the night, but a deeper, heavier sound, as if the wind has grown weary of screaming, and now hums through the streets with a slow, oppressive weight. Through the window's frost-blurred glass, you can just make out faint movements in the white haze, shapes that might be trees bending under the weight of snow. In the tenements across the city, scenes both desperate and tender unfold in the dim light of sputtering candles. Families gather in tight circles, sharing blankets, passing cups of weak broth made from boiled potatoes or melted snow, and in some apartments neighbors knock softly on shared walls, 2 taps, then 2 in reply. Simple signals that say, "I'm still here," the kind of fragile reassurance that keeps people anchored when everything outside has vanished into white nothingness. Somewhere in Brooklyn, a woman lights a lantern and hangs it by her frosted window, hoping the glow will reach her son who went out early in the storm to look for extra coal. She does not know that he is sheltering in a grain shed, only a few blocks away, unable to see more than a hand's width in front of his face, waiting for the wind to ease so he can return home without walking past the building entirely. The collapse of the telegraph lines, the great nervous system of the country, has already cut New York off from the world, leaving the city deaf to warnings from Boston, Philadelphia, and the small towns buried beneath the same monstrous cloud of snow. For the first time in years, news does not move, messages do not travel, and the great humming machine of modern life collapses into silence, so profound that even the ticking of a small wall clock feels too loud. Somewhere, rescue crews have begun tying thick ropes around their waists, stepping out into streets that no longer resemble streets, moving from doorway to doorway, calling out names that vanish instantly into the wind. Some will return frostbitten and exhausted, while others will be swallowed by the blinding white and found days later when the sun finally returns. You sit near your stove, pulling your knees close to your chest, and listen to the house shift and groan under the weight of what feels like an entire sky pressing downward. The wood creaks in slow, tired breaths, as if the walls themselves are shivering in the cold, and yet there is something strangely comforting in being held inside this fragile shell of warmth, as though the world outside has paused and the only thing left to do is wait. Evening begins to fall again, though you would not know it by the darkness, which has remained unchanged since morning. The flame in your stove flickers and stretches, painting long shadows across the room, and for a moment the storm quiets, as if drawing breath for whatever comes next. And in that pause you can almost imagine the city sleeping beneath a blanket so thick that even time moves slower, each hour stretching into something longer, heavier, and eerily calm. And as you settle closer to what little warmth remains, listening to the distant, lonely sigh of the wind as it slips through frozen cracks, you realize that you are living not just through a storm, but through the reshaping of a city, a moment when the familiar world has been erased and replaced with something vast, white, and strangely silent. By the time the second morning arrives, the storm has already transformed New York into something unrecognizable, a landscape without edges or streets or horizons, a place where everything familiar has been swallowed into a single continuous whiteness, so deep and so absolute that it makes you momentarily doubt whether the world beneath it still exists at all. When you touch the window pane again, the frost clings so thickly to the glass that it is like pressing your hand against the inside of a frozen lantern. The stove has died once more, leaving your breath hanging in the room like pale smoke, and your fingers tremble as you shovel the last remaining coal into the belly of the iron furnace. The flame catches slowly, grudgingly, a small glow that feels far too fragile for the scale of the storm outside, yet you crouch beside it anyway, warming your hands like a traveler sitting beside a campfire in a desert at night, grateful for even the faintest hint of heat. Outside, the storm has shifted again, not weaker but quieter, as though conserving its strength. The air is thick and still, the wind replaced by a kind of heavy, breathless silence, the kind that settles in the wake of some great unseen movement, and this silence makes the city feel eerie and dreamlike, as if everything beyond your walls has been placed under some strange enchantment. You try the window again, pressing gently against the frame, but it no longer opens at all. Snow has welded it shut, sealing it as tightly as if someone had hammered it closed, and when you tap the glass, the sound is swallowed instantly, absorbed by the dense frozen layer outside, giving you the uncanny feeling that your home is not simply sheltered from the storm, but buried beneath it. Historians would later write that on this second morning, entire blocks of New York were entombed like ancient ruins beneath giant waves of snow. Chimneys poke through the surface like lonely markers, roofs sagged under enormous weight, and doors opened directly into walls of white taller than the people trying to escape, while newspapers from neighboring states, printed days later, described the city as a frozen archipelago of rooftops, floating in a sea of snow. Somewhere nearby, a faint rhythmic sound brushes through the quiet, the steady scrape of a shovel on wood, a neighbor trying to dig out a narrow path along their roof, so they can reach the chimney and free the smoke trapped inside. Each scrape sounds distant, like someone working in the next world instead of the next building, and it reminds you that countless others are performing the same desperate chores behind their own walls, beating back the cold hour by hour. You melt more snow for water, watching it turn slowly to liquid in the kettle, the surface steaming gently, as though the storm outside has been distilled into the cup you hold between your hands. The taste is thin and metallic, but the warmth spreads through your chest with quiet relief, chasing away the shivers just long enough for your thoughts to settle. Somewhere beyond your sealed window, you imagine the streets as they must look now. Horses frozen mid-stride, carriages buried so deeply that only the iron tips of wheels poke through the drifts, telegraph poles snapped at their bases, their wires tangled like broken spider silk beneath the snow, and the elevated train tracks twisted and groaning under the weight of ice, their once proud steel skeletons reduced to shivering shapes in the white void. People across the city begin tapping on walls again. 2 knocks, then 2 in return, a small ritual of survival repeated in thousands of apartments, each quiet exchange confirming that someone else is still alive on the other side. In a city where voices cannot travel beyond a few feet, those faint knocks become more comforting than any spoken word. In wealthier neighborhoods, servants and family members climb into attics, pushing upward through snow-packed skylights to create narrow vents so fireplaces can breathe again. Some people emerge onto their rooftops like winter moles, blinking in the eerie white glow as they carve tunnels with shovels, the snow so deep that they move across their own roofs as if walking through a miniature canyon made entirely of ice. One rumor drifting through survivor accounts describes a group of neighbors who carved a tunnel between their townhomes on the Upper West Side, allowing them to share food and warmth without ever stepping outside. Whether the story is true or not, it lingers because it captures something essential about the storm, the way it forced people into isolation, and yet pushed them toward each other at the same time. The silence outside soon grows so complete that even your heartbeat seems louder than it should be. Occasionally the quiet is broken by a dull thud, the sound of a distant roof giving way, or a heavy branch collapsing under the weight of ice, each noise echoing strangely through the stillness, as if traveling through a world made of cotton and frost. You move from room to room, touching the cold walls, listening to the faint groans of the house settling under the icy burden, and every few steps you pause to make sure you can still hear the small, steady ticking of your mantel clock, the only reminder that time continues to move forward even as the world around you seems frozen in place. Evening settles quickly again, though the sky outside gives no clue of the hour. The storm's light creates a strange, dim glow that makes everything inside the room look softer, as if softened by layers of frost and quiet, and the flickering firelight dances on the walls like a fragile, golden heartbeat in the deep cold. You sit down, pulling your chair close to the stove, and listen to the muffled world outside, a world reduced to distant cracks, whispered drafts, and the steady breathing of a city forced into hibernation beneath a weight of snow, so immense that it has erased everything except the simple will to endure. When you wake again, though waking feels almost like drifting from one layer of cold into another, the first thing you notice is not the temperature, but the silence. A silence so thick and absolute that for a brief and uneasy moment you wonder if you've gone deaf, because the world outside no longer growls or moans or cries under the weight of the storm. It simply rests, breathless, as if the air itself has been stunned into stillness. You sit up slowly, rubbing life back into your hands, each knuckle stiff with cold, and the frost on the window has grown into elaborate patterns overnight, curling into shapes that resemble leaves and feathers and ferns, transforming the glass into something almost beautiful, though the beauty feels distant and fragile, the kind that belongs to nature rather than safety. When you try the door again, it opens only a sliver, just enough for a blade of white light to cut into the room, and beyond that thin line you see the snow has risen nearly to shoulder height, the drift packed so tightly that it looks more like carved stone than anything soft or fragile. You close the door quickly, feeling the cold sink through the air like a slow-moving tide. Historians later wrote that the drifts on this second day were some of the deepest ever recorded, piling into strange, sculpted shapes that made entire neighborhoods unrecognizable, forming towering ridges that stretched across avenues and swallowing fences, stoops, and street-level windows so completely that even familiar routes looked like untouched wilderness. Your next thought, after the shock of seeing the white wall outside, is for your neighbors, and you pause with your hand pressed against the wall, listening. And there it is, faint but steady, 2 soft knocks coming from the apartment next door, a signal you had agreed on without ever expecting to use it. You knock back twice, and the reply comes again, confirming that at least one other person is still alive on the other side of the cold plaster. There is something deeply human about that small exchange, those gentle taps traveling through layers of wood and brick and silence. They feel like a lifeline in the frozen emptiness, as important as fire or food, because in a storm like this, knowing that someone else is still there, still breathing, still enduring, can keep fear from settling too deeply in your bones. You kneel by the stove again, feeding it small pieces of what remains, a few lumps of coal, a scrap of wood, anything that will burn, and watch the flame struggle, flicker, and finally rise into a weak but determined glow. You cup your hands around it, feeling warmth spread through your fingers, and for a moment the world feels slightly less hostile. The kettle trembles as you melt more snow for drinking water, and the scent of warm steam curls through the room, with a softness that stands in sharp contrast to the cold pressing against every crack in the walls. The tea you make is thin and metallic, but it warms your throat, reminding you that there are still small comforts to be found even in the midst of disaster. Somewhere far off, beyond the walls of your building, a sound rises through the still air, a muffled thump, then another, then a long, distant scraping that echoes strangely across the frozen rooftops. You imagine people climbing out through attic windows, digging narrow paths along the tops of their houses, carving thin trenches through the drifts, so that smoke from their stoves can escape and warm air can circulate again. It is said that some New Yorkers tied ropes between chimneys and walked across snow-covered rooftops like travelers crossing a mountain range, guided only by memory and instinct, their footprints forming faint, temporary paths above the buried city. Letters from survivors mention seeing neighbors appear suddenly from the whiteness like ghosts, their scarves frozen stiff around their faces, their eyelashes coated with ice. A peculiar rumor, one historians still debate, tells of people waving colored flags from their rooftops in an attempt to communicate with neighbors they could no longer reach. Blue meant safety, red meant help, yellow meant food needed or offered. Some believe these signals were never truly used, while others swear that faint flashes of color could indeed be seen flickering through the snow like strange winter lighthouses, guiding those brave enough to venture outside. Inside your home, surrounded by frost and quiet, you imagine those flags fluttering above the buried streets, and you can almost hear the soft whisper of their fabric in the wind, like birds fighting against the weight of the storm. You return again to the window, pressing your palm gently against the ice-crusted glass, and for a moment, despite the danger, you feel an odd sense of awe at the sheer scale of the storm, at the way it has reshaped the city, at the strange and haunting beauty of a world reduced to white silence. Cities are usually loud, restless, constantly shifting machines, but now, entombed beneath layers of snow, New York feels ancient, almost mythical, as though the storm has pushed it out of time entirely, turning it into something that could belong to any century or none at all. And as you sit by the small, stubborn flame of your stove, listening to the house creak and the distant, muffled sounds of others surviving behind their own walls, you realize that the storm has not only trapped the city, it has connected it in strange, invisible ways. Every person waiting, listening, and hoping inside the same vast white silence. By the time daylight reaches your room again, not as sunlight, but as a faint, milky glow that slips through the seams of the window like a shy intruder, the storm has already settled into its most relentless phase, that strange middle stretch where time becomes heavy and uncertain, stretching itself like cold taffy until minutes and hours blend into something slow and almost dreamlike. You sit up, hugging your coat closer around your shoulders, and for a moment you simply listen, trying to determine whether the storm outside has grown stronger or weaker, only to realize that it has taken on a new personality entirely, one that no longer howls like an angry beast, but broods with a low, ceaseless hum, a sound that feels less like wind and more like the entire sky vibrating above the city. You move toward the window carefully, your breath rising in slow, trembling clouds that hang in the air long after you exhale, and when you press your hand to the frost-coated glass, the cold bites through your skin so sharply that it almost feels alive. Beyond the frost you can see only the vaguest hints of movement, swirling ribbons of white that crawl and twist along the surface of what used to be streets, creating strange miniature valleys and ridges, as if the storm has taken pleasure in sculpting the city into a landscape no one has ever walked before. The stove flickers weakly behind you, the last handfuls of coal giving off a wavering glow that paints trembling shadows along the walls, and you crouch beside it, coaxing the flame higher with pieces of scrap wood, old paper, anything at all, because you know that warmth will not come from outside for many hours yet. As you watch the fire catch and breathe, you cannot help but think of all the other homes across New York The cramped tenements, the brick townhouses, the grand mansions, each one hosting a small fire just like yours, a tiny, stubborn ember, fighting back against the immense cold pressing from every direction. And it occurs to you that these faint glows are like scattered stars beneath the snow, hidden points of survival in a vast frozen sky. Somewhere in the silence beyond your walls, the storm loosens its grip just enough that faint sounds begin to carry again, strange and distorted, travelling through the snowpack like whispers passing through cloth. You hear what might be a horse whinnying, long, low, and muffled, or perhaps only the memory of such a sound reshaped by the storm, and then the soft, rhythmic clang of metal on metal, which could be a neighbour attempting to break open a frozen gate, or the distant ringing of a bell trapped beneath a snowbank. The noises feel disorienting, as though distance itself has shifted, stretching some sounds farther away while dragging others too close, making it impossible to tell what belongs to the present moment and what the storm has stolen from yesterday. You imagine the rescuers now moving through the city, not on streets but along rooftops buried beneath the drifts, tied to each other with ropes so they don't vanish into the white abyss, calling out through scarves frozen stiff against their mouths. Somewhere, a team of volunteers is likely trying to clear a path to a stranded train car, where passengers have been huddled together for nearly a full day, sharing blankets, rations, and warmth. Their windows coated so thickly with ice that they cannot see the storm outside or the faces of the people working desperately to reach them. Historians later wrote that these rescuers sometimes walked right over carriages buried completely beneath the drifts, never knowing that only a few feet below them lay horses, wagons, and human beings waiting in darkness for help that could not find them quickly enough. Your own building creaks again, a deep, low groan running through the wooden beams like the tired sigh of an old ship struggling against the weight of a rising tide. The noise makes you hold your breath, listening for any sign of collapse, any hint that the roof might be bowing beneath the drifts. But the house settles back into its cold stillness, and you exhale a slow ribbon of fog, grateful for the momentary stability. It is strange how quickly your sense of safety shifts. Yesterday you worried about slipping on wet cobblestones or missing the last ferry, and now every creak in the wood feels like a conversation between you and the roof, a promise that it will hold a little longer. You melt more snow for water, pouring it carefully into the kettle, and watching the steam rise like tiny ghosts escaping from the frozen world outside. The water tastes faintly of metal and cold air, but it warms your hands and throat enough that your body begins to relax, releasing the tension that has settled into your shoulders. As you drink, you imagine the countless others across the city doing the same thing. Mothers heating small pots of snow for their children, elderly people sipping weak tea in dim rooms, entire families sharing a single cup passed from hand to hand, each sip a reminder that life continues even when the world outside has gone quiet. And then faintly you hear it again, 2 knocks on the wall beside you, gentle and steady, the signal you arranged with your neighbour days, or perhaps only hours ago. Time feels fluid, now moments stretching and folding back on themselves, but the meaning of those knocks remains clear. They are still there. You knock twice in return, pressing your fingertips to the cold plaster, and in that small exchange, that tiny rhythm of human presence, you feel a warmth stronger than the stove's flame, a kind of solidarity that spreads through your chest and reminds you that even in a city transformed into a frozen labyrinth, people can still find each other through walls and snow and silence. The day drags on, its progress marked only by the dimming and brightening of the strange white glow that replaces sunlight. Sometimes the storm's breath softens, allowing you to hear distant thumps and thuds, perhaps the collapse of a rooftop under the heavy weight of ice, or a door being forced open against the frozen drift, or a sled being dragged over the hardened surface by rescuers who have abandoned wheels entirely, and other times the silence grows so complete that you can hear only your own heartbeat and the faint crackle of your fire, as though the entire city has been placed under a giant glass bell. By evening, the storm still rages, though its voice has changed once more, becoming a low, relentless whisper that curls around the buildings like a cold hand sliding across stone. You close your eyes for a moment, letting the sound wash over you, and you think of how strange it is that a storm can be both violent and soft, both a force that destroys and one that hushes the world into a kind of cold, uneasy sleep. And as you settle down beside your stove for another long night, wrapped in layers of blankets, and listening to the faint, steady breathing of the wind outside, you cannot shake the feeling that the storm is no longer just weather, that it has become a presence, a vast, indifferent thing that has wrapped itself around the city, holding it in a frozen embrace that will not loosen until it decides the time is right. As the night deepens once more and the small flame inside your stove flickers in weary arcs across the dim room, the storm outside seems to gather itself into a new shape, not louder or more violent than before, but somehow denser, as if every snowflake falling over the city now carries an extra weight, an extra chill, an extra whisper of intention. The wind no longer screams, yet there is a heaviness in the air that makes the walls feel closer, the ceiling lower, and the very concept of warmth feel like a distant memory, rather than a nearby comfort, the kind you can almost recall but cannot touch. You rise slowly, your limbs stiff from the cold and from the strange half-sleep that has claimed you for hours, and as you approach the window you notice that the frost on the glass has grown even thicker, curling into elaborate spirals and swirling leaves that seem almost alive in the faint glow of the stove. When you finally press your palm against the icy surface, the pain feels as if it has fused with the snowbank outside, as though the world beyond your walls has transformed into a single solid mass of white that holds the entire city in its frozen embrace, waiting silently for the moment it will release its grip. The soundscape has changed again, shifting from the muffled hum of earlier to a deeper, more unsettling silence, the kind that carries the faint illusion of movement, like a distant breath or a heartbeat that isn't truly there. You hold your own breath for a moment, listening, and the silence stretches around you like a vast, empty room, swallowing every small creak of the floorboards, every faint settling of the roof beams, until your mind begins to imagine shapes and shadows shifting on the other side of the frost, even though you know there is nothing there but the endless snow. Far across the city, rescue teams are still attempting to move from building to building, navigating the drifts with heavy ropes tied to their waists, so they do not vanish into the seamless white. They call out as they go, their voices disappearing into the density of the storm, and although they cannot know it, their shouts sometimes echo faintly through the layers of snow and frost, altering themselves into strange melancholy tones that drift into the homes of those listening in the quiet, transforming human voices into sounds that resemble distant horns or faint bells trapped beneath the weight of winter. Somewhere not far from your building, you hear something shift, a heavy, slow groan of wood pressed too tightly under the snow's immense pressure, and you turn instinctively toward the sound, frozen in place, waiting to see if it comes again. After a long pause, there is another deep crack, lower this time, followed by the muted thud of something collapsing in the distance, perhaps a shed roof or a small porch losing its battle against the storm. Yet even those noises are swallowed so quickly that they seem almost imagined, as though the blizzard itself is reluctant to let any sound escape into the night. You return to the stove, adding the last pieces of usable coal to the embers, and watching the small flame rise with an effort that feels almost heroic, its thin orange glow fighting desperately against the darkness creeping through the corners of the room. As the warmth spreads slowly, your fingers tingle and your thoughts settle, and for a moment you allow yourself to imagine what the city must look like from above, an entire metropolis smothered beneath rolling mountains of snow, rooftops buried, streets erased, chimneys poking up like blackened markers through an endless white sea, all of it silent except for the faint, rhythmic pulse of the wind moving through the frozen canyons. People in other buildings across the city are living through the same slow, heavy hours, mothers singing soft lullabies to children wrapped in blankets, 3 layers thick, their voices trembling not from fear but from the cold. Elderly men sitting near tiny fires, their breath floating in pale clouds as they read old newspaper clippings for comfort. Couples speaking in hushed tones about whether they should ration food or burn furniture, their words barely rising above whispers because even speaking loudly feels too intrusive, too bold, in the presence of a storm that has forced the entire city into a reverent quiet. And yet, despite the silence, despite the cold, despite the feeling that time itself has frozen along with the streets, small signs of life continue to echo between the walls of your building. The soft tapping signal from your neighbor, the faint shuffle of footsteps above you, as someone checks their roof for leaks or breaks in the ice, the gentle scrape of a shovel working somewhere far away, carving a path that might not lead anywhere in particular, but offers the comfort of movement, the reassurance that the world has not surrendered entirely to stillness. As the hours pass, the storm begins its slow return to motion, the faint hum outside deepening into a low, rolling moan, the wind picking up just enough to rattle the shutters again, though without the wild fury of the first night. It is the sound of a storm gathering its second wind, a reminder that the worst is not yet over, and that the blizzard still has the strength to reshape the city one more time before it loosens its grip. You close your eyes for a moment, pulling the blanket tighter around your shoulders, and allow yourself to listen to the storm's changing voice, a voice that now seems to echo with layers, carrying whispers of distant roofs shifting under the pressure, of the Hudson River groaning beneath forming ice, of unseen trees bending and cracking somewhere deep in the whiteness. And you realize that the blizzard has become something more than weather, something vast and almost sentient, a force that has enveloped the city in a white cocoon where the normal rules of time and sound no longer apply. And as you lean your head back against the wall, letting the warmth of the small fire seep slowly into your bones, the thought crosses your mind that perhaps, in its own harsh way, the storm has granted the city a strange kind of pause, a frozen heartbeat in which people must be still, listen, endure, and wait for the moment the world will begin to thaw. As the blizzard gathers itself for another long assault on the silent city, there is a moment, brief but unmistakable, when the air changes again, when the white glow beyond your window seems to pulse softly like the dim light beneath the surface of a frozen lake, and in that suspended, breathless pause, you feel as if the storm is inhaling, drawing in strength from the cold depths of the sky, before exhaling another wave of wind and snow that will bury New York even deeper beneath its shifting, restless blankets of ice. You rise carefully, wrapping your coat around your body, and as you approach the window you notice how the frost has thickened into crystal formations so dense that the world beyond looks like a blurred watercolor painting, a seamless wash of pale whites and muted blues. And when you press your palm to the glass, the cold rushes through your skin in a sharp, almost electrifying shock that makes you pull your hand back instinctively, as though you have touched some ancient, indifferent creature lying asleep outside your home. The quiet in the room feels immense, as if every sound is suspended on invisible threads, and when the stove cracks softly behind you, the noise echoes through the stillness with surprising clarity, reminding you that the walls around you are now the only thin barrier separating your fragile warmth from a world entirely transformed by the storm's relentless breath. You move back toward the fire, feeding it the last shreds of burnable material you can find, watching the flames rise with slow determination, their orange tongues licking at the darkness like small, comforting guardians standing between you and the vast cold outside. Somewhere in the distance, a deep, rolling moan rises, the sound of the wind gathering force behind the tightly packed snowbanks that block every street and alleyway, and as it grows louder, you feel the floorboards shiver gently beneath your feet, a subtle reminder that the storm is not finished sculpting the city into its strange new shape. The sound echoes through the buildings like a long, drawn-out sigh, heavy with the weight of ice and time, and you realize that the second surge of the blizzard is arriving like a slow, unstoppable tide. People across New York feel it too, though most cannot see more than a foot beyond their windows, In cramped tenements, families sit closer together around stoves that struggle to stay lit, children wrapped in blankets that are too thin for the cold creeping through the walls, their parents speaking softly so the little ones will not sense the fear in their voices. In larger townhouses, servants move through dim hallways, checking for drafts, sealing windows with spare cloth and heavy curtains, and in wealthier mansions coal is shoveled into great hearths that roar defiantly against the cold, though even those great fires seem fragile now in comparison to the icy force pressing in from every direction. Somewhere farther uptown, a man climbs into his attic, pushing upward against a small window frozen halfway open. He forces it the rest of the way and emerges onto a rooftop covered in snow, so deep that only the very tips of chimneys are visible. And as he takes in the eerie emptiness around him, the roofs of houses blending seamlessly into one unbroken white plain stretching all the way to the distant haze of the river, he feels as if he has stepped into another world entirely, a world where streets and sidewalks and familiar boundaries have vanished beneath a landscape shaped by nothing but wind and silence. He ties a rope around his waist and makes his way cautiously across the buried rooftops, searching for signs of his neighbors' vents, knocking on chimneys to let people know someone is out there, and each knock echoes faintly through the snowpack, drifting down into rooms where families sit hunched by weak flames, suddenly alert and comforted by the knowledge that someone above them is alive, someone is moving, someone is watching over the icy labyrinth that has swallowed the city whole. You picture him for a moment, his boots sinking into soft drifts that reach almost to his knees, his scarf frozen stiff against his face, his breath rising in clouds that disappear immediately into the swirling white around him, and you imagine the strange sense of isolation and awe he must feel, walking on the rooftops of New York, as though crossing the spine of some ancient slumbering beast, each step echoing faintly through a city that has become unrecognizable under the storm's layered shrouds. Back in your own room, the wind begins its return in earnest, rattling the shutters and sending cold drafts whistling through the narrow spaces between the boards. The sound of the storm's breath fills the room like a low, steady drumbeat, steady but unpredictable, the kind of rhythm that makes you feel as though the entire building is breathing along with it, expanding and contracting with the pulses of air as the blizzard resumes its work. You huddle closer to the fire, feeling its warmth wash gently over your skin, though the cold still clings to your back like a shadow. The flame flickers and curves toward the direction of the incoming draft, as if bowing to the storm, acknowledging its power, and for a moment you are struck by the fragile, almost poetic contrast between the two forces. The cold outside, vast and indifferent, reshaping the city with sweeping strokes, and your little fire inside, stubborn and human, fighting back with quiet light and a warmth that feels, in its own small way, like defiance. Outside, the storm builds itself into a slow crescendo, the wind tightens into sharper gusts, the snow begins to swirl with renewed fury, and faint cracks and thuds echo across the buried neighborhood, each one a sign that the blizzard is not merely returning but strengthening, as though it has remembered some unfinished task and has come back to complete it. The fences, rooftops, and unseen structures of the city groan under the renewed weight, creating a symphony of distant, muted sounds that rise and fall in the storm's white breath. And as you sit there listening, wrapped tightly in your blankets with your cup of thin, warm water held between your palms, a thought settles quietly into your mind. Not fear, not exactly, but a kind of stunned respect for the sheer immensity of the natural world, for its ability to stop a city as large as New York in its tracks, to mute its noise, dim its lights, slow its heartbeat, and remind every person sheltered inside their fragile walls that nature's vast hand can descend at any time, covering streets and stories and daily routines in a blanket of snow so thick that even time seems hesitant to move. The second surge of the blizzard has arrived, and the city beneath it braces once more, waiting for the moment when the white tempest will loosen its grasp, when the winds will tire, and when the world, now paused under a snowy veil, will begin to stir again. As the storm reaches what will later be remembered as its most merciless and unrelenting peak, the world outside your fragile shelter seems to vanish into a single endless movement of white, swirling and shifting with a kind of slow, heavy determination, and for a moment you feel as though the city has not simply been covered by snow, but erased and replaced with something vast and ancient, a frozen landscape that understands no boundaries, no streets, no walls, only the slow pressure of wind and ice, working tirelessly to reshape everything in its path. You listen to the muffled cry of the wind as it presses against the roof, and feel the faint shudder that runs through the floorboards, and in that trembling moment you realize that the storm has become not just a force of weather, but a presence with its own rhythm, its own breath, its own cold will. You pull the blanket tighter around yourself and sit by the stove, watching the last reserves of coal glow like fading embers in a cavern, each spark rising with a tiny burst of hope before sinking back into darkness. The fire gives off a fragile halo of warmth that clings to your skin for a few precious seconds before dispersing into the cold that seeps through the walls, and you find yourself holding your hands close to the flame not only for heat, but for reassurance, as though the little flickering light is a final companion keeping watch with you through the long frozen hours. Outside, the storm seems to have found a deeper voice, a low, continuous roar that echoes in the distance like the ocean pounding against cliffs, though you know the only waves here are made of snow rising and falling in great sweeping motions. Occasionally the wind sharpens into icy daggers, hurling themselves against your shutters with sudden bursts of force that rattle the entire room, and each time it happens you hold your breath, wondering if this will be the moment something gives way, if the storm will punch through the fragile edges of your world. But the house, old and stubborn, holds on again and again, groaning softly under the pressure yet refusing to yield. Somewhere out in the white labyrinth of the city, the rescuers are still moving, slow, determined outlines pushing through drifts higher than their shoulders, their bodies wrapped in layers of wool and canvas stiffened by frost, their boots sinking deeply with every step. They tie ropes from chimney to chimney, from rooftop to rooftop, navigating what used to be streets, but now resemble nothing more than narrow canyons carved through a frozen sea. When they call out names into the wind, their voices are warped into strange, ghostly echoes, some carried away instantly, others bouncing off the snowy walls, and returning in eerie half-tones, making it impossible to tell whether the speaker is a few feet away or lost somewhere beyond the swirling veil. In some neighborhoods, entire houses have been buried so deeply beneath drifts that the only visible part is a small portion of roof or chimney sticking out like a lone marker in a vast, silent field. Families trapped inside burned chair legs, broken crates, even pages torn from old books, just to keep a small flame alive. Children sleep with scarves wrapped around their noses and mouths to warm the air before they inhale it, their tiny breaths rising like delicate clouds above shared blankets. Mothers rock them gently, humming lullabies too quiet to disturb the storm, and their soft melodies mix with the creaking wood and distant muffled crashes that echo across the frozen city. The wealthy suffer too, though in different ways. Their grand homes hold more fuel, more blankets, more food, yet even thick brick and heavy drapes cannot fully hold back the terrible cold pressing against every seam. In some mansions, servants climb into attic spaces, breaking through iced-over vents with iron pokers to let smoke escape before chimneys back up and fill rooms with haze. Even these large houses feel smaller now, dwarfed by the immensity of the storm outside, humbled by a force that makes no distinction between those who have and those who do not. A peculiar truth whispered in many journals of the time tells of people hearing strange, distant booms that seem to come from nowhere, like the sound of cannons fired far away. Modern meteorologists believe these were likely the echoes of collapsing roofs or the explosive cracking of giant ice-coated branches, sounds that travelled unpredictably through dense snow-filled air, distorted into something uncanny and directionless, a reminder that even sound loses its identity during storms of such enormous scale. You hear some of those sounds now, a deep hollow thud that vibrates through the floor, followed by a faint trembling groan from somewhere to your left. Perhaps a neighboring roof sagging under the immense burden of snow, or a distant structure giving in entirely. The noises ripple through the silence like the sighs of a sleeping giant, and each one draws you closer to the stove, to the glow of the small flame that feels, in these moments, like the single thread anchoring you to the world. You pour more melted snow into your cup, watching the steam rise in slow, curling tendrils that linger in the cold air before fading away, and with each sip you feel warmth travel through your throat and chest, spreading gently into your fingers and toes. It is a small comfort, perhaps the smallest possible, yet in a world stripped of all normal rhythms, it becomes a precious ritual. Melt snow, heat water, sip warmth, breathe slowly, a pattern that keeps your mind grounded while everything outside remains suspended in ice. The hours seem to drift by without distinction, the storms roar, rising and falling like tides, and sometimes you catch faint vibrations through the walls, which could be voices, or collapses, or perhaps only the shifting of the wind itself. Time no longer feels like a straight line, but more like a slow swirl, a looping drift, and you realize that in storms of this magnitude, people do not merely endure the cold, they endure the pause, the suspension, the vast stillness of a world that has stopped moving, except for the wind and the snow. And as another long gust presses against the shutter, sending a shiver through the house and a scatter of ash across the stove, you find yourself gazing into the pale frost on the window and thinking a simple, instinctive thought: when this ends, the city will not be the same, and neither will you, because no one passes through a storm like this unchanged. Something in you becomes quieter, slower, more aware of fragility and endurance, more attuned to the soft movement of warmth against cold, and the thin boundaries that separate safety from the vast, frozen world outside. The blizzard is at its strongest now, its coldest breath and deepest fury swirling through the buried streets, and all you can do is wait, listen, and hold close to the small flame that reminds you there is still life, still warmth, still hope curling gently inside the walls of your home. As the long night stretches deeper into its frozen hours, there comes a moment, subtle at first, so gentle you almost miss it, when the storm's furious breath softens, when the relentless roar that has filled the world for days begins to thin into something lighter, quieter, almost hesitant, as though the blizzard itself has grown tired of its endless work and is slowly easing its grip on the city. It is held captive under mountains of snow. You sit up slightly, listening with a quiet, instinctive curiosity, unsure whether you are imagining the change or truly sensing the first faint signs of the storm, loosening its massive, icy hand. You rise from your blanket cocoon, moving carefully across the cold floorboards, and as you approach the window you notice that the frost patterns have grown even more elaborate, branching into shapes that resemble frozen rivers and delicate ferns, and there is an uncanny stillness to the glass now, no longer trembling under the assault of the wind, but resting in a quiet so deep that it feels almost sacred. When you press your palm against it, the cold is still sharp enough to sting, but the glass no longer vibrates beneath the pressure of the storm. Instead it sits heavy and motionless, like a door between two worlds, one warm, dim, and breathing softly behind you, the other vast and silent and hidden beneath snow, tall enough to cover an entire room. The silence is different now, richer and stranger, not the frightened quiet of a world waiting for the next gust, but the heavy pause of a giant that has stopped moving, the stillness that settles over a landscape after something immense and ancient has exhausted itself. You stand there for several long breaths, hardly daring to exhale too loudly, aware that this new quiet feels as delicate as a thin shell that could crack open at any moment, unleashing another wave of freezing wind if disturbed too suddenly. You move back toward the stove, which burns with a small, steady glow now that you've fed it the last scraps of burnable material you managed to gather earlier in the evening, and its warmth drifts across your fingers in a soft, trembling wave that feels almost unreal after days of bitter cold. You hold your hands over the flame and watch as the shadows play along the walls, tiny flickers of brightness dancing in the dim room like sparks of life weaving through the frozen stillness. In the distance, far out in the white secrecy of the buried streets, you hear a sound that has been absent for what feels like an eternity. The faint, metallic rhythm of something shifting under the snow, not a collapse this time, but something deliberate, steady, human. You close your eyes and listen more carefully, and then you hear it again, a slow scraping like a shovel biting into snow, followed by the muffled echo of a man calling out a name or a direction, his voice stretched thin by distance and the insulating weight of the drifts. It is a sound so unexpectedly warm, so unmistakably alive, that your heart tightens in your chest with a quiet, surprising relief. And now, as your ears adjust to this new version of silence, other faint noises begin to reveal themselves. The dull thud of someone trying to push a door open against a stubborn wall of snow, the muffled cries of greetings exchanged between neighbors who have finally managed to reach each other through narrow tunnels carved in the drifts, the metallic clink of tools striking ice, the soft, rhythmic creak of ropes being pulled, taut as rescuers inch their way along rooftops and across frozen ridges. These sounds drift through the storm like delicate threads of life stitching the city back together after days of isolation and quiet desperation. You imagine the scene unfolding outside. Small groups of men, wrapped in layers of wool and canvas stiffened by frost, making their way slowly through waist-deep snow that covers everything from carriages to storefronts. Mothers peering nervously out of attic windows, calling down to rescuers who look more like Arctic explorers than city workers. Children bundled in blankets watching with wide eyes as the first glimpses of movement appear in the white maze surrounding their homes. The city, suffocated, buried, frozen into stillness, is beginning to breathe again, each sound a soft exhale of hope rising into the cold air. Even the rooftops seem different now. Instead of sagging and groaning under the relentless weight of fresh snow, they sit heavy and quiet, as though the storm has abandoned its assault and left behind a landscape of frozen sculptures, chimneys dressed in thick collars of ice, rails and gutters turned into jagged crystal teeth, fences rising and falling in smooth curves beneath the drifts, like the backs of sleeping creatures half submerged in snow. Everything is still white, still immense, still dangerous, yet the feeling has shifted. The blizzard has stopped expanding, stopped clawing outward. For the first time it feels as though something is giving back, not taking more away. You sip from your cup of warm, melted snow water, feeling the heat spread quietly through your chest, and you close your eyes, allowing the soft murmur of distant human voices to fill the hollow spaces left by the storm's retreating roar. It is a strange comfort, hearing other people again after so many hours wrapped in silence, and for the first time since the blizzard began, you feel a small, steady certainty settle in your bones. The storm may not be finished, but its rage has broken, its energy drained, and somewhere beneath the frozen layers of ice and snow, the city is beginning to wake from its long, forced sleep. As you sit by the fading fire, wrapped tightly in your blanket, you realize that you are witnessing one of those rare, quiet turning points that historians later try to capture in journals and letters, the moment when fear softens into endurance, when silence begins to carry the faint notes of survival, instead of the threats of winter, when the storm, immense, merciless, extraordinary, shifts from attack to retreat, not suddenly, not dramatically, but in slow, gentle breaths that whisper through the frozen stillness, like the sighs of something ancient preparing to sleep. And as the city listens to this new quiet, waiting for the next change in the storm's rhythm, you lean your head against the wall, letting the warmth of the tiny fire ease the cold from your skin, and you breathe in deeply, knowing that the worst may still not be over, but the blizzard itself, for the first time in days, has paused. As the blizzard settles into this strange, exhausted calm, the quiet that follows feels almost heavier than the storm itself. A dense, velvety silence that rests on every rooftop, every buried street, every frozen window pane like a thick blanket that refuses to lift. You remain seated beside your small fire, the orange glow flickering gently against your fingers, and for a long moment you simply listen, expecting at any second the wind to return with its old fury, yet all that reaches your ears is the faint, distant murmur of a city caught between sleep and awakening. You stand, moving slowly across the cold floorboards, each step sounding sharper now that the air outside no longer muffles everything into a snowy blur. The silence feels alive in its own way, carrying subtle hints of movement. The creak of a distant structure settling under the frozen weight, the muffled scrape of a shovel digging a narrow trench somewhere beyond your sight, the faint echo of a voice rising briefly before vanishing into the white distance. And although the storm has not yet ended, it has shifted into something less hostile, something that watches rather than attacks, something that allows the city to take a shivering, tentative breath. You approach the window again and notice that the frost along the edges has begun to change shape, melting slightly where the faintest touch of warmth reaches it from the stove. The thick white layer still blocks your view, but you can sense now that the snow pressed against the glass is no longer moving with the same restless urgency. It sits heavy and still, like a thick curtain lowered across the stage of the city, waiting for someone to draw it open. When you press your palm to the cold glass, the chill still bites at your skin, but the pain remains steady, unmoving, no longer trembling under the force of the wind the way it did the past nights. Far across Manhattan, and in the outer boroughs where families huddle near small stoves inside wooden homes, nearly buried beneath drifting snow, people begin to step cautiously into attics and narrow stairwells, testing doors that have been sealed shut for nearly 2 days. Some doors open only an inch before hitting the massive wall of snow outside, and others refuse to budge at all, held fast by the weight of the drift. In those homes, people turn back inside to gather shovels, buckets, even pots and heavy spoons, anything that might carve a path through the barrier, and they begin digging patiently, scraping away layer after layer of packed ice in the hope of finding a thin channel to the world beyond. In one small house somewhere in Brooklyn, an elderly man hoists himself up through a hatch into the attic, his lantern gripped tightly in one hand as he pushes open a frozen skylight that cracks and splinters beneath the gentle pressure. When he finally manages to shove it open, a wave of cold air pours in like the breath of the storm itself, carrying with it a brightness so blinding that he must turn his eyes away. For a moment he simply stands there, lantern light trembling across the attic beams, looking out across a world transformed into a white rolling sea, where only the tips of chimneys and the peaks of buried rooftops disrupt the frozen horizon. He waves his arms slowly, testing whether anyone nearby can see him through the thick brilliance of the snow, and after several seconds a faint movement appears on a distant rooftop, a shape lifting an arm in return, the small, fragile gesture bridging the wide gulf between two people who have been separated by the blizzard's immense silence. Others soon join, stepping carefully onto their roofs, gazing out across the frozen expanse, calling names that drift like pale echoes across the snow before dissolving into the cold morning. You imagine these scenes as you stand in your own dim room, hands wrapped around a cup of warm melted snow water, feeling the heat seep slowly through your palms and into your tired limbs. The image of neighbors emerging onto rooftops, like figures rising through the surface of an icy ocean, makes your chest tighten with a strange, unexpected warmth. Even in the worst moments, in the harshest cold, people find ways to declare themselves alive, to look for one another in the vast white silence. The faint tapping on your wall returns. 2 soft knocks, your neighbor's signal, the one that has anchored you to another human presence throughout this seemingly endless storm. You knock twice in return, pressing your fingertips gently to the cold plaster, allowing the simple rhythm to resonate through the quiet. For a moment, you imagine the woman next door sitting in her own room, bundled in blankets beside a small fire, relieved to hear your signal. Two people separated by only a wall, yet bound together by the same storm, the same cold, the same slow, fragile hope that morning will eventually break the spell the blizzard has cast. You hear a new sound then, the distant, rhythmic crunch of footsteps on compacted snow, and you realize that rescuers are venturing back into the labyrinth of drifts, climbing over rooftops, threading ropes through window frames, shouting names down narrow shafts that used to be streets. You hear the faint echoes of their voices, but the snow changes each shout into something soft and blurred, as though the city itself is whispering their words back to them. They are mapping the landscape anew, discovering which blocks are passable, which houses are buried too deeply, which families need immediate help. And though the storm has not yet ended, though the wind still circles slowly through the frozen air, and the temperature remains brutally cold, there is now a sense of movement, of subtle change, as if the blizzard has retreated just far enough to allow human life to begin pushing back against its icy walls. The city is still trapped, still smothered, but the moment of total helplessness has passed. What remains now is the slow, deliberate work of emerging from the storm's grip. You sit back down beside the stove and close your eyes, feeling the soft flutter of warmth travel across your cheeks, and in that dim, fragile glow you sense something you have not allowed yourself to feel in many hours. The first faint shimmer of relief. The worst might be passing. The silence outside is no longer the silence of destruction, but the silence of a storm preparing to loosen its hold. And in that quiet, in the trembling warmth of your small fire, you breathe a little easier, knowing that the world, frozen, buried, humbled, is slowly, cautiously beginning to wake. As the storm's fury fades further into the distance, the city begins to enter a strange liminal state between crisis and awakening. A moment that feels neither like the true end of the blizzard nor the beginning of recovery, but rather a quiet suspension, a deep breath held across the frozen landscape. You move slowly through your dim room, the blanket wrapped around your shoulders trailing behind you like a heavy cloak, and each footstep echoes softly in the stillness, reminding you how much the sound of your own presence stands out now that the storm's relentless roar has subsided into hushed whispers. You crouch beside the stove, the fire inside reduced to a trembling orange glow, its heat faint but persistent, and as you warm your hands above it, you feel the cold tightening around the rest of the room, filling every empty space like a watchful ghost. Yet even within that cold there is a subtle shift, a slight thinning of the chill that presses against the window, a gentle softening of the draft that slips beneath the door. These small changes feel almost insignificant, but after days spent in the grip of a storm that swallowed the entire world, any shift at all feels like a herald of something larger approaching, something softer, something hopeful. When you press your palm to the window this time, the glass still bites into your skin with its familiar sharpness, but the frost patterns seem different, less aggressive, less jagged, as though the ice that clung so fiercely to every surface is beginning to relax its grip. And behind the frosted veil you can see the faintest tremor of movement, not the swirling chaos of the storm, but soft, drifting particles that fall gently through the air like the tail end of a snowfall, the final signature of a storm too exhausted to rage any longer. In the distance, beyond the sealed doors and frozen stairwells, you begin to hear clearer human sounds, no longer distorted by wind or buried beneath layers of snow. The sharp tap of a shovel striking ice, the low rumble of a voice calling instructions, the scraping drag of something heavy being pulled through the drifts. These noises rise through the stillness like the first notes of a symphony warming up, each sound carrying the warmth of human effort, the determination of a city refusing to remain buried forever. You picture the rescuers again as they traverse the frozen rooftop world above the streets, men wrapped in heavy coats, their breath rising in thick clouds as they dig narrow trenches along the edges of buried chimneys, calling down into vents and broken windows to search for signs of life. Their boots leave deep impressions on the surface of the snow, each footprint a small victory against the endless, shifting white. They tie ropes between roofs like makeshift bridges, guiding one another carefully inch by inch, because the drifts beneath them are not solid ground but deceptive, shifting layers that can collapse easily under the wrong step. Even so, they continue moving, carving paths through the silence with the steady persistence of people who understand that survival depends not on speed, but on patience and resolve. Inside nearby homes, families begin to stir from the half-sleep that the storm has imposed on them. Children blink awake beneath heavy blankets, rubbing their eyes and whispering questions to their parents, asking whether the storm has ended, whether they will be allowed outside soon, whether the world beyond the window still looks the same. Parents answer with soft, uncertain words, offering comfort in a voice that hides its own doubt, knowing that even though the worst appears to have passed, the cold that remains is still deep, still dangerous, still demanding caution. In some houses, people gather near the faint light spilling through attic windows, trying to peer out at the landscape beyond. What they see is a world so different from the one they remember that it leaves them silent, breath caught in their throats. Streets that once bustled with horses and carriages are now indistinguishable from open plains, buried beneath rolling dunes of snow that stretch uninterrupted from one end of the block to the other. Staircases, fences, doorways, all have disappeared under the storm's thick sculpted waves. Only the chimneys remain, rising like ancient stone pillars in a frozen desert. You imagine these scenes unfolding as you take another sip of warm snow water, feeling the heat spread gently through your chest. There is something humbling about knowing that the entire city, rich and poor, young and old, sees the same white wilderness now, shares the same shock, breathes the same frigid air. Every neighborhood, every social class, every household has been equalized by snow. Even the mansions with tall gates and iron fences have vanished beneath the drifts, reduced to the same soft curves and buried outlines that shape the tenements and row houses. The tapping from your neighbor returns, this time slower, softer, almost hesitant, and you respond with your own gentle knocks, each one carrying a quiet message of endurance. The thought that another person is only a wall away, surviving the same ordeal, sharing the same eerie silence, brings a warmth to your chest that is almost stronger than the fire's. In moments like this, the thin barriers between strangers feel thinner still, as if the storm has stripped the city not only of its sound and movement, but of its distances, revealing hidden threads of connection woven through the cold. Then, as you sit quietly and listen, you hear a new sound, faint at first, almost mistaken for a creak in the wood, but as you tilt your head, the noise grows clearer, resolving into the distinct crunch of footsteps approaching your building, followed by muffled voices exchanging short, breathy words as they work their way along the drift outside. The rescuers have reached your street. You imagine them outside the door, using shovels and gloved hands to carve a small path, scraping away layer after layer of hardened snow, their silhouettes casting faint shadows against the pale glow filtering through the drift. They speak softly to one another, pacing the work with calm, methodical breaths, and for a moment you close your eyes, letting the slow rhythm of their labor become a soothing undercurrent in the quiet, a sign that the frozen world is stirring, that hands and voices are reclaiming space from the cold. And as you sit beside your tiny, loyal flame, wrapped in the weight of your blanket with the murmur of rescuers drifting through the snow, you feel something settle inside you, a fragile but undeniable sense that the blizzard's long night is lifting, that the world beneath the frozen dunes is beginning to stretch and wake, that every small noise you hear is a step toward air and light and movement again. As the rescuers carve their slow path toward your door, the sound of their shovels becomes a steady, rhythmic heartbeat, echoing faintly through the frozen barrier outside, each scrape and thud blending with the muffled quiet of the buried city, in a way that feels almost ritualistic, as though they are chiseling not just through snow but through the lingering tension of the storm itself. You sit by the window, listening, feeling the vibrations travel through the walls like distant footsteps in a dream, and with every passing minute the noise grows clearer, sharper, more human, breaking through the thick silence that has wrapped the world for what feels like an eternity. You close your eyes for a moment, imagining the scene on the other side of the frozen doorway. Men stooped against the cold, their breath rising in thick white puffs as they dig side by side, lanterns strapped to their jackets casting soft yellow halos onto the tall walls of snow. Their movements are slow but deliberate, carving out a narrow corridor that descends toward the door of your building like a passageway into another world. The snow packed around them rises in smooth, towering ridges, sculpted by the storm into shapes that curve like frozen dunes or layered cliffs. And as they dig deeper, the light from their lanterns reveals subtle tints of blue within the hardened layers, as though the storm had captured pieces of the sky and buried them here. In other parts of the city, similar tunnels are forming, long, slightly curved passages carved by neighbors and rescuers alike, winding their way from one buried home to the next, connecting front doors that have been sealed shut under the weight of days' worth of drifting snow. These tunnels, narrow and fragile, illuminated by candles and lanterns placed at intervals to guide the way, begin to look less like emergency escape routes and more like the arteries of a living organism, bringing movement and connection back to a city that has been forced into stillness. Families peer out from attic windows or cracked open doors to watch the rescuers' lanterns bobbing in the white labyrinth, the flickering lights appearing and disappearing like small stars weaving through the frozen landscape. Grandmothers wrapped in thick shawls whisper prayers of gratitude as they hear the scrape of shovels approaching their own homes. Children lean forward with wide eyes, imagining that these tunnels are magical pathways leading to unknown lands beneath the snow. Even the sternest men feel a quiet sense of relief settle in their chests when the first faint echo of human voices reaches them from outside. It is remarkable how much comfort a single sound can bring after days of isolation. A muffled shout, a distant laugh, the hard crunch of boots compacting fresh snow, each one reminding people that they are not alone, that somewhere nearby others are enduring, surviving, pushing forward through the frozen hours. You press your ear gently to the window frame, carefully tuning your senses to the faint noises drifting through the ice-packed drift. The distant thumps have become clearer now, a strong shove here, a long scrape there, and every so often you hear a faint call, a single word shouted through layers of snow, only to arrive at your side as a soft, almost ghost-like whisper. Even though you cannot make out the words, the cadence tells you everything. They are checking each home, each doorway, making sure that the people inside are still alive. You move back to the stove, adding what little remains of your burnable scraps, and watching as the fire catches again, lighting the room with its golden glow. The warmth it offers is thin but comforting, and you sit close to it, your knees drawn up to your chest beneath the blanket, listening to the city around you begin its slow emergence from the blizzard's grip. It is an awakening not of shouting or sudden motion, but of careful steps, gentle efforts, and cautious voices, like a patient recovering gradually after a long illness. When you return to the window, you notice something new, a thin, dark line edging across the bottom corner of the frosted glass. At first you think it might be a crack, some weakness caused by the cold, but then you realize what it truly is. Light, not the white, diffuse glow of snow pressed against the pane, but a soft amber flicker from a lantern shining somewhere on the other side of the drift. The rescuers have dug close enough now for their lanterns to cast light into the edges of sealed windows, their glow sliding across the thick ice, like the first hint of dawn returning to a world long lost in winter's shadow. The sight pulls a long, slow breath from inside your chest. You lean in closer, your forehead nearly touching the frozen glass, and watch the faint glow shift and tremble as the rescuers move. The idea that there are people just a few feet away, working to free your building from its snowy prison, fills you with a deep, quiet gratitude. the kind that settles not in words but in the steady release of tension through your shoulders and the softening of your heartbeat. In your mind's eye, you imagine the moment soon to come, the soft rumble of snow falling away from the doorway, the cold rush of air that enters the room when the men finally break through, the beam of lantern light slicing into the dimness of your home like a warm, golden thread unrolling across the floor. You imagine stepping out into one of those narrow tunnels, the walls of snow rising so high on either side that they blot out the sky, the air around you filled with the metallic scent of frozen iron and lantern smoke, the crunch of snow under your boots echoing down the corridor as you follow the rescuers back toward a small clearing or central point where neighbors gather to check on one another. The thought is strangely soothing, not frightening. After days of isolation and silence, the idea of emerging into a tunnel carved by human hands feels like an embrace, narrow, cold, humble but unmistakably alive, a path made by people for people through the heart of the storm. And as the soft glow grows brighter on the window's edge, a warm pulse in the icy shell that has held you captive, you realize something profound in its simplicity. The blizzard is no longer in control. People are moving again. Voices travel, light spreads. The city, though still buried, has begun to stitch itself back together through tunnels of snow and faint lantern flames. You breathe in deeply, feeling warmth from the stove mingle with the cold air near the window. And for the first time since the storm began, you allow yourself to believe that rescue and daylight are slowly carving their way toward you, one careful shovel stroke at a time. The faint glow on the window grows stronger as the rescuers' lanterns draw closer, the light pulsing gently through the layers of packed snow like the heartbeat of something warm hidden behind a frozen wall. And as you watch that fragile shimmer dance across the frost, a soft sense of anticipation stirs inside you, not excitement exactly, but a quiet recognition that something is changing, that the long, suffocating stillness of the past days is finally giving way to movement, that the city is no longer holding its breath but slowly exhaling into the cold air. You move back to the stove, holding your hands above the tiny flame that has become a lifeline through the blizzard's cold grasp, and as the warmth spreads gently into your fingers, you realize how deeply the storm has carved itself into you, the rhythm of melting snow for water, the constant listening for distant sounds, the careful rationing of every scrap of heat. These routines have become your companions, steady and reliable, but now, for the first time since the blizzard began, they feel like they are preparing to loosen their hold, to step aside for something new. Daylight, fresh air, the murmur of nearby voices no longer distorted by wind or buried beneath frozen layers. The tapping on your neighbor's wall comes again, this time more assured, more confident, the rhythm clear and strong, and when you knock back, your knuckles brushing against the cold plaster, the reply follows immediately, echoing softly in the silence between your homes. You imagine the woman next door wrapped in blankets just as you are, her eyes lifting toward the faint amber glow on her own frosted glass, her breath catching with the same blend of exhaustion and relief. The storm may have buried each of you in separate worlds of cold and quiet, but now those worlds are beginning to rejoin, each knock on the wall a bridge returning to life. When you approach the door again, you hear them, the rescuers' voices, still muffled by the thick walls of snow, but clearer than before, their words carried in short bursts through the narrow space carved between the drift and your home. Their voices rise and fall in steady rhythms, reassuring one another, calling out to the buried homes on either side, checking for movement, listening for knocks or faint cries. Occasionally, a laugh echoes between them, small, tired but real, a sound so warm, so human, that it feels like a lantern being lit inside your own chest. Then comes the sound you've been waiting for, a heavy scrape directly against your door, followed by a dull thud as the snow shifts under their shovels. You can hear them discussing how best to clear the entrance, their words layered with the deep confidence of people who have already freed dozens of homes just like yours. The noise grows louder with each passing moment, and you step back slightly, your breath rising in soft clouds, your hands trembling from a mix of cold and anticipation. With one final heave, a large section of the snow blocking your door collapses downward, sending a muffled cascade of powder tumbling into the tunnel they've dug outside. And suddenly, a thin blade of golden lantern light slips through the narrow crack at the door's edge, stretching across your floor like the gentle unfurling of a bright ribbon. It is the first true unfiltered light you have seen since the storm began, and its glow transforms the dim room into something warmer, softer, more alive. You approach the door cautiously, your hand resting on the cold metal handle, and as you push outward, the door opens only halfway, hitting the dense snowbank that still clings to the frame. But even that small opening is enough. What you see beyond it stops your breath for several heartbeats. The tunnel carved through the snow stretches forward like a long, luminous corridor, its walls rising high above your head, sculpted smooth by shovels and illuminated by lanterns hung at even intervals along the path. The snow glows a muted blue near the base, fading into soft pearly white near the top where the lantern light brushes it. The air inside the corridor is cold, but not as sharp as the storm's earlier breath. It feels like a cold born of stillness rather than attack, the kind that grips the skin but not the soul. A rescuer stands framed in the warm lantern glow, bundled in layers of wool that are stiff with frost, a thick scarf wrapped around his face so only his eyes remain visible. They are kind eyes, calm and focused, and the moment he sees you, he gives a slow, reassuring nod, lifting the lantern slightly so its glow reaches your face. Behind him, two others continue to clear the path, their shovels scraping rhythmically against the snow. The man closest to you speaks, his voice low and steady, saying they've been clearing the entire block, that most people are accounted for, that the storm has quieted enough for them to reach even the deepest drifts. His words arrive as soft, warm vibrations through the tunnel, and though he speaks of hardship, his tone carries a gentle certainty. You are safe now. You step into the tunnel carefully, your boots sinking slightly into the packed snow beneath you, and the cold air brushes your face like a cautious greeting. The tunnel feels both intimate and vast. Intimate because the walls are so close you could run your hand along them if you wished. Vast because it stretches into the distance, winding past buried porches and frozen staircases, leading toward a faint gathering of lantern lights where other neighbors are emerging from their homes, bundled in blankets, guided by rescuers' voices. In the quiet glow of those lanterns, you see shapes moving, silhouettes wrapped in thick layers, faces pale but relieved, hands reaching out to help one another along the uneven floor of the tunnel. The city, once buried and silent, is beginning to breathe again through these fragile corridors carved beneath the snow. And as you take your first steps into this strange, beautiful maze of ice and light, you feel a warmth rise in your chest, not from the fire behind you, not from the lanterns ahead, but from the simple, enduring truth that people, even in the deepest winter, will always find their way back to one another. The first steps you take into the tunnel feel almost unreal, as though your feet are touching something both familiar and transformed. The packed snow beneath you firm enough to hold your weight, yet soft enough to remember every movement. The air inside the passage is cold but strangely welcoming, a narrow ribbon of breath and lantern light winding through the enormous silence of the buried city. And as you walk slowly forward, wrapped tightly in your blanket, you feel a sense of safety blooming in your chest, not because the storm is gone, but because you can finally hear the rhythm of human voices again, rising and falling gently along the snowy corridor. The rescuers guide you with calm gestures, their lanterns swinging softly and casting warm halos that glide over the sculpted walls of the tunnel. Each wall rises high above your head, smooth and curved like the inside of a glacier, the snow packed so densely that it glows with faint shades of blue and pearl where the lantern light touches it. You reach out once, brushing the surface with your fingertips, and the cold is immediate and sharp, leaving a delicate sting in your skin, but there is something strangely calming about its solidity. After days of being sealed behind walls and windows, the snow no longer feels like a threat, but like a sleeping giant you are slowly walking past. As you move farther along the corridor, you begin to hear the soft murmuring of neighbors gathering near a wider clearing ahead, a gentle blend of voices that carries through the tunnel in warm waves. Voices speaking in hushed tones out of respect for the quiet around them, as though the city itself is still asleep and must not be startled awake too suddenly. When you finally reach the opening, the space takes your breath for a moment. A small courtyard-like chamber carved entirely from snow, its high walls curving inward like the interior of a cathedral, illuminated by several lanterns placed carefully along ledges carved from ice. Their golden light fills the frozen chamber with a soft, almost sacred glow. Families stand in small clusters within that light, wrapped in blankets and scarves, their cheeks flushed from the cold, but their expressions softened with relief. Children cling to their parents' hands, peering around with wide eyes at the mesmerizing shapes carved by the storm, while elderly neighbors lean on the arms of rescuers, guided gently along the uneven snow floor. Even the rescuers seem to move more slowly here, as though this chamber has its own quiet rules, its own fragile serenity that encourages everyone to lower their voices, to breathe deeply, to absorb the stillness rather than disturb it. Somewhere near the far edge of the chamber, a man begins to describe what he saw when he first emerged through his attic window that morning. A world transformed into rolling white hills, fences erased, streets buried beneath mountains of snow that rose higher than wagons, higher even than some roofs. He speaks slowly, his voice echoing gently off the curved walls, and the small group around him listens with hushed wonder. Another woman describes how her chimney had frozen over, forcing her family to burn old baskets and broken shelves just to keep their stove alive through the worst of the storm. Her voice trembles, not from fear, but from the weight of the days she has endured. You find a place near the side of the chamber, leaning lightly against the cool snow wall, and as you look around you become aware of how strangely beautiful this moment is. Dozens of people gathered beneath a frozen sky, breathing the same cold air, sharing stories that rise like gentle smoke toward the shimmering frost above them. There is no rush, no panic, only a deep shared understanding that the worst has passed and the work ahead, digging out homes, checking on the most vulnerable, rediscovering the city beneath the drifts, will require calm minds and steady hands. A rescuer approaches you and asks whether you're warm enough, whether you have food left, whether anyone else lives in your home who might need help. His voice is kind and steady, and as you answer, he nods with the ease of someone who has already walked along countless rooftops and tunnels, someone who understands the difference between fear and fatigue, between isolation and relief. He assures you that more paths are being cleared, that volunteers are checking nearby homes one by one, and that soon the tunnel will connect to a larger network leading toward a temporary station where warm broth, blankets, and medical care are being offered. As he speaks, you can see faint trails branching off from the chamber, narrow tunnels that snake away into the distance, their walls glowing softly under the lanterns that line their paths. You imagine where they might lead, to clusters of neighbors who have gathered in similar clearings, to buried porches where rescuers dig in careful arcs, to quiet streets that have been carved open by hand so that people can move again beneath the deep snow. The city, still frozen, is beginning to flutter with movement, like a winter creature stirring from an enforced hibernation. You notice your neighbor standing nearby, wrapped in a shawl and holding a steaming cup of melted snow tea passed to her by one of the volunteers. When she catches your eye, she gives you a small, tired smile, the kind of smile shared between people who have survived something immense together, even if separated by walls. You move closer, exchanging a quiet greeting, and for a moment both of you simply stand there, absorbing the soft lantern glow and the slow hum of human voices. The wind outside the tunnel's opening gives one last low sigh, a quiet reminder that the storm hasn't entirely released its grip, but the sound no longer carries the same edge. It feels distant now, weakened, like the dying breath of something that has burned through all its fury. You tilt your head slightly, listening, and realize that beneath that sigh lies another sound, a faint, distant dripping, the first delicate hint of melting somewhere along the snow surface above. It is almost imperceptible, a tiny shift in the frozen world, but you hear it nonetheless, the early heartbeat of thaw, the promise that the snowbound maze around you will soon give way, inch by inch, to the familiar shape of streets and doorways and open sky. And as you stand there beneath the lantern-lit chamber carved from winter itself, surrounded by the murmurs of neighbors and the soft scrape of shovels echoing through the tunnels, you feel a deep, quiet certainty settle in your chest. The storm is not yet finished, but the city is waking, and every breath you take now carries a little more warmth, a little more hope than the one before it. As the hours pass within the lantern-lit chamber of snow, you begin to sense the world shifting in ways so subtle they might have gone unnoticed, if not for the sheer quiet that surrounds you, a quiet so deep and steady that even the smallest change ripples through it like a gentle wave across still water. You hear the dripping again, a soft tapping somewhere far above, the kind of fragile sound that would normally be swallowed by the noise of a city. But here, in this frozen cathedral of white walls and warm breaths, it becomes a sign, a promise, a whisper from the sky saying that the storm's long grip has begun to loosen at last. The rescuers guide people slowly through the branching tunnels, helping them find their footing on the uneven snow, their lanterns glowing like small, patient stars scattered across the maze. You move with the others, each step measured and quiet, the snow beneath your boots crunching in a gentle rhythm that feels almost ceremonial. The tunnel seems to stretch for miles, curving past buried storefronts and frozen fences, past chimneys rising like dark stone pillars, until finally, after what feels like an entire night contained within footsteps, you see a faint shimmer of natural light ahead, a pale silver glow that grows brighter with every breath you take. When you emerge from the final tunnel, stepping out into the open, the sight that greets you steals your breath, not because it is frightening, but because it is astonishing. The storm has sculpted the city into something unrecognizable yet heartbreakingly beautiful. Towering drifts shaped like frozen waves, cresting over rooftops. Broad fields of snow where avenues once roared with carriages. Icicles dripping in long crystal spears from window ledges, each one catching the faint winter sun and scattering it in shards of soft, shimmering light. The sky above is pale and calm now, a washed-out blue brushed with gentle streaks of gold, where the sun begins its slow rise. People stand scattered across the snow-buried neighborhood, wrapped in thick blankets and scarves, blinking toward the light as though waking from a strange dream. Some hold one another tightly, tears slipping down their cold cheeks as the enormity of the storm's passing settles into them. Others simply stand still, eyes closed, letting the sunlight warm their faces, feeling for the first time in days the tender touch of something that is not wind or ice. Children laugh softly, their small boots disappearing into the deep snow as rescuers lift them onto safer paths. Voices mingle in the crisp air, warm, human, alive, blending into a slow murmur that fills the frozen landscape with the sound of return. You take a few steps forward, feeling the light kiss your face, and for a moment you close your eyes, letting the warmth sink into your skin. It is faint, just a whisper of heat, but it carries a sweetness that makes your chest tighten with quiet gratitude. Around you the snow sparkles like crushed diamonds, each crystal reflecting the light of a morning that nearly didn't come. The storm has reshaped everything, homes, streets, routines, yet in its wake it has revealed something deeper. The extraordinary resilience hiding softly within ordinary people, the quiet bravery of neighbors who knocked through walls and carved tunnels, the unspoken promise that even the coldest nights can be endured when warmth is shared in small, gentle ways. As the rescuers continue to guide families towards safer shelters, you look back toward the tunnel you emerged from, the carved passage glowing faintly under the lanterns left behind. It seems almost impossible that just hours ago you sat alone behind sealed windows, listening to the storm's endless breath. Now you stand beneath a sky, returning slowly to colour, surrounded by voices and movement, wrapped not only in blankets but in the certainty that the worst has passed. The city will need time to heal, days to clear the streets, weeks to rebuild what was lost, years to forget the sharpest edges of fear. But for now, standing here beneath the soft rise of the sun, you feel only the great, gentle relief of survival. You breathe deeply, letting the cold air fill your lungs, letting the warmth of light brush the shadows from your thoughts, letting the world settle once more into its familiar rhythm. And as you take your first true step into this snow-shaped dawn, you realize something simple and profound. Even in the fiercest winter, morning always finds its way back. Even buried beneath mountains of white, life waits patiently. Even in silence, hope listens. You walk forward, leaving soft footprints in the snow, the first of many the city will make today, and the world, slowly but surely, begins to take its shape again.